thing to consider is, how many strategies do you have? How many strategies ought you have? Would you imagine that if you have more money, if you're a jurisdiction that has more money, you may have more strategies than other communities that don't have as much money? Well, you know, we do research every year looking at closeout annual reports, and here's the results of our research to answer this question. The hypothesis was, the larger your distribution, the more your strategies are going to be, the more numbers of strategies. And the answer is no, that is not in any way a predictor of what we see out there. We see some small jurisdictions, look at that one small city, doesn't even get the minimum distribution, has 9 strategies. That's like, what is that? That's $5 for each strategy. And then we have some large communities that don't have as many strategies as you might think they do. On average, the large communities do have more strategies than the small communities, reading the red text here. But there is no predictor of how many strategies. You can imagine that the more strategies you have, the more burdensome your administration would be. Each unique strategy has different rules, maybe requires different qualifications to be eligible. Like, we all know everybody's got to be income eligible, but we were talking about with the purchase assistance strategy, you got to make sure they're credit worthy too, that there's a first mortgage provider who will offer them enough financing. So the more strategies, maybe the more expense you're going to have. These next 2 slides just kind of demonstrate that, especially when we talk about the 2 most popular types of SHIP strategies, rehab and purchase assistance, can we recognize there's a lot of different types of strategies in those categories? Because certainly I've seen that we have, you know, there's a spectrum. Sometimes we repair just a couple of things on a person's house, and we call that emergency repair. And sometimes we go in there and practically build them a whole new house. We don't really demolish the house, but we really do substantial repair. And then somewhere in the middle is moderate repair. But then also, sometimes if the house is too far gone, we do demolish it and we build a new house. That is what many people still consider kind of in the vein of a rehab strategy. We call that replacement housing. Sometimes we do repairs that are only oriented for some special needs category. Earlier I was pointing out an elderly rehab strategy, which has priority to assist only elderly people. Sometimes another special needs category, maybe people with disabilities, they may need regular repairs plus accessibility modifications, you know, like grab bars in the shower, or an accessible cabinet, things that we're going to talk about in a second when we talk about universal design. And so a barrier removal or an accessibility modification strategy, that is yet another type of repair strategy. In a similar way, let's look that you might have multiple strategies that would be considered purchase assistance. Maybe the first one, look at all these acronyms right here. First one, down payment and closing cost. This is what we mostly consider a home buyer strategy. But then you could also have home buyer assistance. Oh, new construction. We talked about that earlier. This is money that's provided up front, usually to a nonprofit organization, subsidy right when they're first building the house. That subsidy ultimately will be passed on to the home buyer, but that's a different type of strategy. Sometimes you have purchase assistance that not only provides down payment and closing costs, but it also helps to repair the house. That's a different type of strategy. And sometimes, and I really don't understand a big distinction between the two, sometimes communities have 2 different strategies which distinguish between helping buyers get a newly constructed house or purchasing an existing house. All of these, so they're not redundant, but all of them are very similar. And so the main point that I want to suggest to you is go back to your office, look at your plans. Are there any opportunities for combining strategies? The more you combine strategies, the easier it will be for you to track, I believe. the easier it will be for people from the outside to understand the general landscape of what you are offering with your SHIP program. And so, for example, couldn't we possibly have a strategy that would, on the one hand, say, sometimes we'll help a home buyer with down payment and closing cost, and sometimes we'll also provide repairs in addition to that. Sometimes we'll help people buy existing houses, and sometimes you could also buy a newly constructed house. That could all be done in one strategy. You could even say, if you get just down payment and closing cost assistance, your maximum award will be $20,000. If we also use SHIP to pay for repairs in addition, the maximum award will be $25,000. You can have all of those distinctions listed in one strategy. And there might be some efficiency with doing that, especially if you can figure out a way of combining strategies in such a manner that an applicant only gets assistance from one strategy, not from two. Because I've certainly seen where a community will have a purchase assistance strategy, allows you to buy an existing house. The person buys the house, and then they reapply the next week for your rehab strategy to get the house repaired. Well, why don't you just offer repairs through your purchase assistance strategy, and they only get assisted one time. There's only one SHIP file. There's less paperwork. There's less confusion. And also, on the annual report, you wouldn't have this household was assisted with this strategy, this household was assisted with this other strategy, just a bunch of numbers. It looks kind of on the annual report like there's 2 households that were assisted, but in my example, there's really only 1 house that was assisted. Yeah?
You're very correct about it, because we have a rehab strategy. Well, we changed it up previously. We had rehab, substantial rehab,
Yeah.
all that stuff. So in the regular construction rehab, it's 40,000, and if it's over the substantial, it's another 40,000, which gives you 80,000 for a specific household.
Yeah.
So when I report in annual reports, I list the strategy, and when you put the amount, they say in construction rehab 200,000, on substantial rehab 100,000, but I put 10 people on the first
Yeah.
and 0 on the second. So Terry wrote back to me, she was like, she had the 0 on red, which means like, what's up with that? You spend money, you have no people.
Yeah, I
so
see.
I have to explain that
Right.
they're the same people as
Yeah.
the above strategy, so I don't have to come.
And you didn't want to duplicate. Yeah, you wanted to avoid duplication. But here again, it's confusing. You had to explain it to somebody who, on the outside of your program, it's not so obvious to.
Just combine them.
Now, since you mentioned about the annual reports, I think I forgot to mention that on the subject of looking at your strategies, let's also recognize that for the last couple of years, the annual reports require you to assign a code to each strategy. And there's a limited amount of codes. There's, I think, about 14 different codes trying to represent all the different things that you can do with SHIP. Now that's a lot. That's a lot of different codes, and yet still I feel like we may have come across instances of some strategies. Somebody will call me before they turn in the report. How do I characterize this one? And I'll help them the best that I can. I suggest on their cover letter that they provide Florida Housing with just a little something. Hey, I used this code for this type of strategy, which does this sort of thing. It might be helpful so that Florida Housing could consider whether they want to upgrade their codes by creating a new type of code for a slightly different type of strategy. We'll see. I don't know if they're into updating their codes or not, but just a word of care for categorizing your strategies properly. I understand why Florida Housing wants to do that. They're trying to quantify as much as possible what you're reporting to them. They do have to ultimately take 120 different jurisdictions' annual reports and clump it all together to issue a report to the legislature. And anything they can do to kind of automate that process will help them. So that's just something to consider. You will have to code every single one of your strategies. One word of warning. You're combining strategies together, getting them all nicely and efficiently clumped together. The one caution I would give you is it probably doesn't make sense to combine strategies together if One part of what you're saying you can do is going to be a home ownership activity, but another activity that you're saying you can also do with the same strategy is a rental activity. And like, for example, you might say, well, let's have a development strategy. Sometimes we develop single-family homes, and sometimes we develop homeless shelters. It'll all be one strategy. I'd say those things are too distinct and separate. They deserve more than one strategy. And after all, there's a lot of places in our SHIP program where you have to distinguish home ownership strategies from rental strategies. You have to do that on your housing delivery goals chart when you first decide what you're going to use a distribution for. You have to use it on your annual report. So it probably doesn't make sense to clump those very different types of activities together.